With the local tech sector growing rapidly, New Zealand businesses have new opportunities to participate in the digital revolution. But how do they keep up with the global pace of change? We're joined by tech entrepreneur, futurist, and professional director, Melissa Clark-Reynolds. Melissa discusses her long career at the forefront of New Zealand's tech sector and shares her views on how New Zealand businesses can embrace the possibilities of tomorrow. She also tells us about her work as a futurist and how she uses pattern recognition and research to shape her clients' future business strategies. In conversation with our Chief Client Officer, Stefan Clark, and Chief Investment Officer, James Grigger, Melissa starts by telling the fascinating story of how she became an entrepreneur in the first place. This is the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds.
Melissa, it's really great to have you here. Thanks for joining us bright and early on a Monday morning. Let's kick off with a little bit of a question about your early days and your trajectory into entrepreneurship. And how did you, where did you start out and how did you find yourself heading in that direction?
Look, I was a teenage mum, and I was caught, couldn't afford childcare, couldn't afford not to work. And there really wasn't much simpler than that. I didn't intend to be an entrepreneur. I just literally couldn't get a job that paid enough for me to pay rent and childcare. And particularly, pay equity is still pretty appalling in New Zealand in lots of ways. I know we report the average, which looks a lot better than the median, but the median's pretty dreadful. It's around 70 cents, in the dollar that women earn to men. And it wasn't much different kind of 40 years ago when I became a mum. So I realised quite quickly that working from home 40 years ago was a much cheaper option, 35 really, was a much cheaper option than trying to figure out how to get a job that I could afford to live on, which is, so they talk a lot about accidental entrepreneurship in the literature, and it always cracks me up, whenever I used to get surveyed by various government agencies, it would never have a question like economic necessity. It would always be, entrepreneur had a brilliant idea or driven to create some invention or something, but basically I just couldn't afford any other path. And
wow.
And it's been great. There is absolutely pay equity as an entrepreneur. I've never had to really ask anybody what I could earn or how, so I've done it for most of my career. I can't imagine, really, sounds awful, but I'm totally unemployable now.
I doubt that. I totally doubt that.
I don't know that I could go every day.
Others obviously disagree because you've got lots of roles.
The phone book of your CV is otherwise. A couple of organisations wanted a little piece of your knowledge, but
yeah. I think the other one is that, we were laughing the other day about, I have one of these very busy minds that needs to do multiple things at once. And I think that suits both entrepreneurship and professional directing and consulting, because I have a bit of a magpie mind. I have a mind that likes to take ideas from things that might seem really unrelated and put them together. And I think that entrepreneurship has really rewarded that, whereas many sort of linear careers, they reward getting deeper and deeper into a subject rather than perhaps magpieing or picking kind of eclectic bits from multiple careers. So, I've been really lucky, I guess, to be less obtuse for the people who don't know me, is I was lucky enough to, I went to an all-girls high school where there were 6 of us in my final year. They taught girls subjects, which didn't include applied maths, and so I got bused to a boys' school, and the local boys' school, it was the first year that they taught code. Way back, quite some time ago, so we're now talking 1979, I learnt to code, and our school didn't even have a computer. We used to mail our code to IBM in Wellington, and it would mail it back 2 weeks later in a self-addressed envelope. But what it did was that it gave me a real kickstart into thinking about really the application of applied maths, and I've used that in the rest of my career. So I haven't coded all of my career, but understanding algorithms, understanding big data. I started working on big data projects in the mid-80s, which turned into kind of what is really now artificial intelligence and predictive analytics, and commercialised those in a company that I owned in the 90s. And so, when people tell me about like disruptive tech, I pretty much yawn, because all of these disruptive techs have taken 40 or 50 years to develop. The virtual reality headset was patented before I was born, and you can hear I'm no spring chicken. And it's been the next big thing since the 50s. Artificial intelligence, we've been working on it a very, very long time in multiple different forms. I do think that it's going to have a major impact, but a lot of it's already in our daily life. What do you think your Google search is? So we're using a lot of it, but it may not be as disruptive as we think when we think, oh my God, something's come out of the blue and it's going to sideswipe us. I'm yet to see one of those technologies in my career.
Let's just hark back for a moment. And so I was actually going to ask this later, but seeing you've gone there already. So you're a young mum, and then you obviously found a love of learning. Yeah. And I understand you went to university very early as well. Is that right? But
I did.
My sources say you were one of the youngest ever in New Zealand.
And what's nice is that there are some young people who have gone now, but I went at 15. I'd finished school. It wasn't like I jumped from year 11 or something. I'd finished the equivalent of what was called the 7th form in those days, year 13 in current world, and I'd run out of school, really. I'd been captain of everything. I was house captain and captain of a bunch of sports and captain of debating, and it wasn't like you just suddenly took a 15-year-old and dropped them in. My friends, I'm off to a reunion actually of my last couple of years of high school coming up, and my friends were all 2 or 3 years older than me. It just kind of made sense, And so when I went to university, I actually didn't tell anyone that I was 15. I was kind of deeply embarrassed, that whole Kiwi thing of try to fit in, don't look too weird. And so it wasn't really until I was in my 20s that I kind of outed that I'd gone to university at 15. But part of this issue around being an entrepreneur was that I was a graduate on youth rates, and that really sucked. So I'd done an honours degree, and I was still on youth rates, and that was part of what drove me to think about how I had to really think about my earning differently. I did go back later, and not that much later, but took a couple of years, worked, and then went to the States and did a master's there. And then I've pretty much, in terms of lifelong learning, I'm pretty much always enrolled in something or just done a course somewhere. I've just been to the UK and done another course in foresight and strategy. And I imagine that for the rest of my life I will continue to learn formally or informally. So I do know of a few young people who've gone younger than me now, but they've gone part-time rather than full-time. Yeah.
Your CV obviously has a lot of impressive university names against it, Stanford, MIT, etc. How have those institutions shaped your thinking? And obviously having gone to one of these bigger schools, it's led you to think it's worth going to the others.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. When I left New Zealand, I still had that bit of a cringe about kind of being smart. And when I went to the States, what was really interesting was that in my master's program, 10% of the class got cut every semester. So every semester, the bottom 10% just got kicked out. And I realised that I'd sort of hidden in the middle of the pack a bit because I didn't want to do the tall poppy kind of stand out. And one of my professors basically took me aside and gave me a good hard kick in the ass and just said, look, you're one of the smartest people in this class, get on with it. You haven't come all the way from New Zealand just to be in the middle. And it was probably one of the best things that happened to me was to sort of leave New Zealand at quite a formative time in my 20s, and to realise that it was really okay to be competitive. Do you know, and I don't feel like that now, but it stood me in good stead in my 20s and 30s as an entrepreneur, particularly, that it was really okay to like be excellent, want to win. And I think that we need a little more of that. Do you know? Like, I don't think
I was
we
about
need
to
it
ask you
at
that,
toxic
Melissa.
levels, but we do.
You've mentioned that a couple of times around tall poppy in New Zealand, and that just competitiveness, but you've said embarrassed to be smart and things. Has that changed over your career, or do you think there's an issue there? Because you go to the US for meetings or to do business, and it's the people you meet are unbelievably passionate and inspirational, and actually they're no smarter than a New Zealander. They're just a lot more confident about their sort of place in the world.
Yeah, I think that we could instill a bit more confidence in New Zealanders without turning into, like, I don't know, you feel like, but without turning into dickheads. Do you know? I really do, and I think we almost think it's binary, that somehow you're either really confident means that you're really arrogant, and they're not the same thing at all. I think it's okay to have a real quiet faith in where you want to go and how you're going to get there. Doesn't have to be showy, and it doesn't actually have to climb over anybody else. And I think we need to find a way for that to be okay in New Zealand. We have a lot of discussion still, I think, about New Zealand companies lacking aspiration. And I do think that, and I think some of it is just we lack permission to be aspirational. And then when people are aspirational, sometimes, we fail, right? I've had a company fail. We will fail if we're pushing envelopes, if we're trying to build new technology, if we're trying to build brand new stuff, we will fail. And I think New Zealanders are really way too hard on people that fail, and we've seen that with, whether it's young people committing suicide who are promising entrepreneurs, or, we are quite an unforgiving nation on the other side. So there's that tall poppy, please be average, and then if you do step up and you fail, we pile in. And I just think that's really damaging. We need to actually, and I don't mean that, people who fail on purpose, or, I'm not talking about fraud here. I'm talking here about people who just give it a good crack and don't get there. I think we're just not kind enough to them, whereas in the American system, we're better.
When you think about, you just said you had a business that failed, and you think about all the top entrepreneurs that you get a lot of access to now because of things like podcasts, all of them talk about their failures, huge failures, whether it's financial or business or schooling or
personal.
Whatever it is.
They often don't label it as a failure, though. They often label it as, a learning
probably
experience.
Felt pretty shitty at the time.
I reckon that's just become like a euphemism. Do you know? I think you feel like you failed at that moment, and later you might be able to reframe it as a learning experience. But when you're in it, you feel pretty bad. You really do. And no one wants to fail. Like, I always find that fail fast thing. I know that they work for a government department, because no actual entrepreneur wants to fail. No entrepreneur is going to use words like fail fast. Do you know? They might talk about learning. They might talk about iterating. They might talk about trying to close off all of the options that don't work. We don't tend to use the fail word, because I actually think most entrepreneurs are more driven by the fear of failure than we are from the desire to succeed. And I don't think that matters. Whatever gets you through. But, anyway, I think we often don't talk enough about those failures, largely because, they hurt.
In Silicon Valley, it seems to me that if you haven't failed a few times, you're not ready for the big league. So that's almost a positive.
I wanted to come back to one other thing that you said earlier, which is that, when I see New Zealanders go out and pitch for capital in the world, and I've done it myself, in New Zealand we have that sort of self-deprecating thing, and we don't want to be show-offs. And so when we're pitching, in America they'll go, I've got 10 users, it's incredible, it's the most amazing thing in the entire universe, and I'm a god. And then New Zealanders will have 1 million users, and we'll go out and we'll go, yeah, it's not bad. And then the venture capitalists will kind of go, well, if it's not bad, why are you here? Like, you know, I'm only investing in things that are phenomenal. And I think there's a bit there, and we don't have to turn into total hype, but some of our language doesn't really help us when we are out there on the world stage. You know, I see a lot of New Zealand companies really doing incredible things, but still almost describing what they're doing as, you know, it's okay, it's not bad.
So how do you change that, Melissa? Is there something... I mean, what, do you start a university course on pitching? It's probably...
I think we have to do more of that. I was really grateful in my master's that we actually did a studio course. We did a course that was with a real live client on a real live issue. And so we had to learn like how to scope, how to manage a project, how to manage a team. You know, New Zealand's got some weird stuff where TEC, the Tertiary Education Commission, actively opposes people being able to get too much credit from group work. Whereas this course that I did in the States, it was worth 2 courses and the entire class got 1 grade. You know, so you had to make sure that everyone in your class got over the line. And if there was someone who was slack, too bad. Do you know, like pull up the slack then, take on their work, get it done, because I wasn't prepared to get a C because I was going to go, well, he was supposed to do it. Do you know?
Well, if you own a business, then that's the same concept.
Same deal, right? I'm not going to go, oh yeah, one of my employees forgot to do X, you know. So I think there's some of that. I think that we blather on about being team players in New Zealand, and yet here we have an education system that actively opposes team playing, do you know? And I think that's one thing we need to think about is how do we really encourage group work early on, encourage people to pull each other up. And then the other thing I think is that we just, there's the blowing your own trumpet thing is good, but I also think it's actually being really willing to acknowledge other people. So, you know, really being willing when someone does something amazing to call that out. And to pile in, instead of just piling in on the failures, piling in on their successes and being genuinely happy for them. So I think if other people see people being happy for people who succeed, it helps to build that momentum as well. So, plus, you know, I don't know, I like, not everybody wants to compete, and I don't think they should, but I think for the kids who want to compete, they should be allowed to. You know,
it's funny, I come from a German background, and they have this concept of Schadenfreude on the one side, but less known is another saying.
What is Schadenfreude?
The joy in other people's suffering.
Right.
And on the other side, there's the joy of seeing other people succeed.
Nice.
My grandmother used to say all the time, and we don't have an equivalent in English. And,
we don't. But I know this is like going to be a weird segue, but fascinatingly, for about 10 years now, one of the biggest things on YouTube for kids has been what they call unboxing videos. I don't know if you know these.
We've banned them in the Gregor household.
Right. But what's fascinating
about... They are addictive.
They are super addictive.
Super addictive.
So for those of you who don't know what these are just like pictures of kids basically opening swag, you know, like opening a Lego box and seeing what's in it, or opening a gift box and seeing what's in it. And what's fascinating is that the biochemistry of watching someone open a gift, you have exactly the same biochemical response as if you got the gift yourself. That's why they're addictive. They make us feel good because we see joy, and they make us feel excited like we got the gift. And it's a bit the same like these TV shows that are sort of matchmaking shows or something, watching other people fall in love, like we get the same biochemical relationship as if, you know, reaction, as if we were falling in love. So I can't know where that's going, so but fascinating. You like eating so much, did you say?
No, weddings.
Oh, weddings. Yeah, it is why we love weddings. You know, they make us feel hopeful. Anyway, I don't know where that was going.
I thought it was the free drinks. But
I was thinking about the joy of other people's success. I think we do get excited. Like I got this ONZM, you know, which is sort of the OBE for New Zealanders for services to technology. And I was a little like, oh yeah, that's kind of nice. What was amazing was my community, you know, particularly as far as I know, I think I was the first woman to get that one. And and my community, like I just got hundreds of beautiful cards and posts on LinkedIn or posts on Twitter, or people who were just like, oh man, this is a vote for us. Do you know, this is a really fantastic to see our community get acknowledged. And I hadn't realised what a difference it might make to the people around me. So,
awesome.
You know, I think that, anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Question. What motivates, and when you think about yourself, what motivates you to keep on pushing?
Well, now
when you're in
is
the
that
zone.
when I'm in the zone, like I'm lucky I've spent almost all of my career in flow. And, you know, I know a lot of people can't say that, but I really, really have. You know, I have literally lived in flow for pretty much most of the last 40 years, which has been pretty amazing. And so I notice when I'm not. Right. And I would say for the first sort of 20 years, I was very focused on providing for my children and I suppose, you know, like proving I could do it and making sure that I had a financial base. You know, my mother was also a single mum and so was my grandmother. So I'd grown up with this, you know, intergenerational trauma, intergenerational poverty. And all I knew was that I didn't want my kids to grow up with all of that fear around what it is to be poor. I didn't know what that might look like necessarily, but that fear drove me at the beginning. I have to say now, at this end of my life, I'm much more driven by wanting to leave the world a better place. I have grandchildren and my own children, and I'm kind of horrified that we haven't solved climate change. I'm horrified that we are still replicating so many problems of the past. And so these days, what I really want to do is take the skills and knowledge and, I suppose, position that I have and use that to influence the kinds of future we want. And I've always had that, you know, I've always worked in businesses for purpose. I've always founded companies that had strong purposes. But it just feels more and more urgent the older I get and the less I see that we've done, and in fact, the more of the mess that we're making.
Is that I mean, when I look through your experiences, and I'm just going to pull out
go for
literally only a few, and so the Bee Trust, you've got Hillary Institute, you've got family planning, you've got Mini Monos, which is a business but also sort of focused on children.
Yeah.
There's a wide range of things there that you're passionate about outside entrepreneurship, perhaps. What's the thematic? You said climate change.
The thematic
when
is people and planet. You know, people and
Right.
planet has come through my whole career. And particularly, I would say, like, you know, my master's is in environmental health. It's got a big chunk of it is in environmental and occupational epidemiology from the Johnson & Johnson Med School, and the other half in environmental planning. So, and I have an anthropology degree before that, which I really was interested in women's health. So, you know, that whole kind of people and the planet has driven me my whole career. It hasn't really mattered what I've done, you know. And, you know, I'm on things like a Lines Trust. You know, some people kind of go, well, why would you do that? But Lines Trusts are really at the forefront of where decarbonisation has to happen in New Zealand. And so, the reason I'm on a bee trust, I am a beekeeper, but I'm also really passionate about agriculture. And, you know, we need bees for pollination no matter what. And we have a very limited genetics pool in New Zealand. So I want to see that get sorted. So for me, it's people and planet. You know, Mini Monos was I always used to joke it was kind of Club Penguin meets The Inconvenient Truth, if you're old enough to know what either of those were. And so it was a virtual world and community for green kids with 1.5 million little greenie children from around the world hanging out together on a games platform, but mostly really wanting to think about how they could have agency over what was happening to the planet around them, whether it was, you know, reducing biodiversity or changes to climate. Our kids have been, you know, the kids who are now in their 20s, they've grown up with this existential angst, you know, their whole lives. And I'd really like to see things different for them rather than just my generation perhaps going, over to you. You sort it now, you know. We've done well. You sort it.
I sort of find kids are even, that when you ask your child, what did you have your nightmare about last night?
Yeah.
It's sort of monsters under the bed, but it's also climate change. And
Yeah.
I don't know, in some ways they're almost too fearful, and so perhaps having an outlet like Mini Monos is something to sort of feel like that they're helping without needing to fear it in that sense is a good way to sort of approach it.
I hope so. I just really feel like children need agency. If we think about anxiety as adults, one of the ways we get over our anxiety is knowing that we have agency over our lives and that we're able to take action. And yet what we often do with children is that we assume that they can't take action, but there's lots of things they can do, whether it's as simple as getting involved with tree planting or, volunteering at the local soup kitchen, or there's so many things that kids can do that give them a sense of being able to change the world around them. I think it's an important thing to do that.
And encourage the joy of making a positive impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you call yourself a futurist.
Yeah.
Can you, I guess as a start, I must admit, I had to look up what a futurist is. I've heard the term a lot, but I didn't really know what the shape and size of it was. Would you mind describing in your terms what that means to you and why it's something you think about?
I was lucky. In 2016, I went to the Te Hono program at Stanford, which is a program that's designed for the primary sector in New Zealand, and it's sort of between the design school and the business school. And there's about 250 of us, I think, now who are in New Zealand agriculture who've been through this program. And while I was up there, we spent half a day with a futurist from the Institute for the Future, and I realised that a whole lot of my skills kind of came together. So I have this strong background in math, which for me is very much about pattern recognition. And then I also trained in anthropology, which for me is very much also about pattern recognition, patterns of culture, patterns of human behaviour, and then patterns of numbers. And as she was talking, I just got really excited. And so 2 weeks later, I went back and I trained at the Institute for the Future as a futurist. And since then, I've also trained with School of Informed Futures and a guy called Suhail Aniatola, who's a preeminent Islamic futurist. And so out of this, I've ended up building a practice in New Zealand where I use that pattern recognition skill, and I work largely on retainer for a number of big food or agriculture-related businesses. And I forecast what's coming, and as well as that, I think about alternate futures for them. So I guess for me, there's kind of the predictive piece, and I do less of that. Though I do some of it. I predicted that Whole Foods would be bought by Amazon sort of 9 weeks out, and I predicted a bunch of stuff to do with Maersk and Alibaba for one of my clients, which came true. When I looked at forecasting what was going to happen with the pandemic, I started warning my clients back in the 31st of December 2019, and then by the 7th of February 2020, we were moving a lot of stuff around and getting out of the Chinese market. And so part of what I do is quite specific, short-term. This is what the Ukraine conflict is going to mean for you as a dairy company, or this is what, the pandemic is going to mean for you as a meat company. I do that quite specific stuff. And then I do much broader, spoke at a conference last week on the future of health supplements, and I've got a particular interest in business models, as an entrepreneur. So I'm interested in what companies on the cutting edge are doing from a business model point of view. So I'll give you an example, is that we see quite a lot of companies have moved, software companies started doing subscription services 20 odd years ago. But now you can see that even a vitamin company is doing a subscription service. So these business models make their way across. You could think about something like the App Store, where you've got some hardware with a Mac and or an iPhone, and the App Stores, where you could think actually Nespresso is kind of the same thing. It's got a hardware, but the coffee is their software, And so I'm really interested in where those business models might go. I get hired to do things like what's the future of cash, I've just done some really, really interesting projects. Future of screens for Weta and the Wellington film industry. But mostly I focus on food and agriculture, and I have a team that works with me that does that.
How sorry that Stefan, I interrupted you, but
I know I was too excited.
Man, I've got heaps of questions. So, is it data driven? Would be my first question, and then say you get given a project to think about. I mean, how do you even start that?
How do I start?
Like, do you go on? I'm sort of thinking I'd go onto Wikipedia first and then go for it. But honestly, like, how do you sort of break down a process of thinking how the future's going to evolve?
Yeah, it's good. If it's a topic I know nothing about, like the cash one was a really interesting one. It wasn't one that I'd really focused on before. I have an analyst who works with me, and she's pretty amazing. She's got incredible research skills. She's way, way smarter than I am. She went to uni young, did her full degree and master's in 4 years. Super smart, and so we'll tend to ask the client who are the best analysts in the area. You know, most industries, even if it's whether it's money or farming or anything, there's usually someone who either is an investment analyst or who writes a blog on that topic. And so I'll usually start by finding out who are the really interesting thinkers in this space. And then we might even just give them a call and ask them what they're reading and what they think is on the edge of whatever that topic is. And then I'll just really immerse myself in where the data is. So it's very data driven. You know, money is fascinating to me. Like, as an anthropologist, what I saw during the pandemic is that cash money became associated with disease. And so we saw, whether it was in New Zealand or overseas, we saw people refusing to take cash and the rise of PayWave. And I've just been in the UK and I took photos all over the place, like very, very few shops or hotels or even the pharmacy that I went into will accept cash now. Whereas 2-3 years ago, they wouldn't have thought about it. But cash is you know, we know that COVID's airborne, but people got sold all this hand sanitizer, sort of what I think is BS, and all of this like spraying surfaces thing. And so money became something that people might have coughed on and therefore dangerous. So that's where I think this anthropology is useful alongside the data, because it gives you some ability to understand what the data is doing. What we also see with the future of money is that we've seen, you know, these alternate kind of payment processes come up. So when I first used to put websites together and it would take us 2 months to get the ANZ to approve us for a DPS, you know, in order to hook our credit card up, I can put Stripe in tomorrow, you know, and then I can integrate Stripe with my Instagram and I can sell stuff off Instagram, or I could sell stuff straight off TikTok now. Those changes, and I know they are technological, but they're really business model changes that have allowed people to move much faster. What we also see on the cash front is, you know, the kind of Alibabas and the Google Pays have just accelerated massively. So one last little thing on that is I look for patterns that might be happening in other sectors as well. So one of the things I'm most interested in around money is that, if you humour me here for a minute, if we think about what's happened during the pandemic is people are now working from home. What has happened in some ways is the transfer of costs from the employer to the employee. So the employer used to pay for the toilet paper and used to pay for the coffee and used to pay for the lights and the rent and everything else. And now the employee pays for all of that themselves. They may get some kind of allowance, or the employer might pay for high-speed internet or something, but it's nothing compared to the cost of what it used to cost to have an employee in the office. Those costs have now been internalised by the employee. If we take that pattern and we apply that to money, what's happening is that the cost of the transaction at the retailer is moving from the retailer to the customer at a rapid rate. And so if you think, I was an early investor in EFTPOS machines, but if you think about an EFTPOS machine, there's all that hardware, the retailer has to rent it, they have to pay for the phone line, there's a whole lot of costs for the retailer there. What we see instead with Google Pay, Alipay, Apple Pay, all of these kind of pay by phone technologies is actually the hardware is owned by the customer and they're scanning a code and that cost has been transferred to the customer. Do you see where I'm going there? And so when you start to look at these patterns, you can see them occur, and they occur like all at once. They don't just occur in one industry. So we could probably think about a bunch of these other things where the cost of sale is transferred over, or other costs are transferred to the client in a way that they weren't in the past. And so I tend to get deep into that detail, find out who the good analysts are, look for where the edge cases are in that sector, and then think about how that might generalise out into broader drivers of change that I'm seeing. I'm going to do a really quick plug here because I do a newsletter for Callaghan, which if anyone in agritech is interested in, they could just Google Global Signals. Comes out roughly once a month, but I'm really looking there for where are those edge cases in agritech around the world and who's pushing agritech in a way that might be really interesting and insightful for New Zealand companies.
You've worked for government departments. How does a government, which is generally, this is probably unfair to accuse the whole government organisation of being slow moving, but it is slower moving just by bureaucracy. And you see these big, fast changes like you're talking about, like payments. All of a sudden, I'm paying 14 cents to buy a can of Coke at the supermarket because of PayWave. And sort of the controversy about where should that cost lie, and shouldn't it be the big tech companies paying for it, or whatever it is. Is that something that governments are going to have to start thinking about and catching up with? And is that something that you're working on that with the government? Because not many people are probably thinking about that within the ministries, I would have thought.
I'm not working on that. I would love to. We had a really interesting unit at DIA for a long time that was focused on futures, and it got disbanded a couple of years ago. And I don't think there really is. They did great service design. They were really interesting, and they're gone. And they did some world-beating work, particularly around legislation as code. And in fact got a bunch of international awards for New Zealand being at the forefront of bringing code into our legislation, but that's all gone. Where I do have some glimmers of hope is that the government, there are these things called BIMs. If you're around Wellington, you kind of know what they are. They're the briefing to incoming ministers. And every time you have a minister change, which might include a change of government, the government department writes a kind of briefing note to the minister of what all the stuff that is going on in the agency is. From my point of view, they've become incredibly bland. They're OIA-able, so people don't say anything controversial in them. They don't say that they're pretty meaningless as far as I'm concerned. This government, I think, got quite frustrated with them and has created a new government tool called an LTIB, which is a long-term insights briefing. And government agencies are currently doing those for the first time. And some of them have really embraced them. And what's nice is that they're not meant to be policy. They're meant to be sort of 50 years out or 30 years out. What is the sector going to need? So Ministry for the Environment, I have been working with them. I've just finished up, but they're doing a really interesting piece of work on what's the future of whenua. You know, what does land look like? And we ran a pile of workshops with rangatahi, so rangatahi with disabilities, migrant youth who were refugees, who were amazing, rainbow youth, and so on, greenie youth, and really asked them about what they thought the future of land was and what they wanted to see it like. And this has got some big implications for when we think about urban planning, when we think about, you know, whether land should be used for housing or for farming and so on. So I think there's some real potential in there. There are some government agencies that have done some fantastic projects. There are a couple have done what I think are just absolutely dreary, you know, very small micro projects that were risk averse that they thought they could manage. But most of them have done well. I've just come back from the UK, as I mentioned. The Finnish government does something really, really interesting, and I met with their government lead for future generations. And what they do is that their parliament produces a report before the handover of each government of what they see as the big issues for Finland going forward. And so it's a cross-party report from an outgoing parliament into an incoming parliament. And so they'll say, child poverty is an issue, or they'll say, we've got issues with whatever the future of energy is. And I think that's a much better process than what New Zealand has, where it's become these really boring kind of patsy reports. But anyway, I've worked with some great agencies. I think the big change that I'm seeing in New Zealand government is that strategy has not been something that government's been very interested in for a long time. And so we're seeing an increase. I work with people like Te Papa Arawhai, the Department of Conservation, about what their strategy is. I work with Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. I think we really need to be clear now about what our theory of change is, what we think we're going to be able to do, why would we change the future. Whereas I would say probably for the last 20 or 30 years, New Zealand government has just been driven off very small incremental policy decisions rather than any kind of good visioning
GDP growth
process.
in the next 2 years rather than...
GDP growth, increase in housing, build however many thousand Kiwi build houses or whatever. They're all separated from each other. They're not coherent. I feel like we've got a real opportunity to perhaps do some real long-term coherent thinking. One last little plug on
the
that.
elections. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say. You go. Yeah.
The other person I met with or two people I met with in the UK that just blew my mind was a woman called Sophie Howe, which is the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, and Jane Davidson, who is an ex-MP for Wales. And she drove through this legislation that now is there that created a Commissioner for Future Generations in Wales, and all of their legislation has to go through a test to see whether it's good for the future. And I think we could really do with something like that in New Zealand. We need to get away from a bunch of this sort of short-term, I think you're probably going to talk about 3-year election cycles.
Oh, I was just going to say that's a theme that's come up here lots and lots of times. And, we've canvassed it in this call with, people from lots of different places. So hopefully at some point that actually becomes discussed.
Yeah, hopefully.
My question, though, was sort of at a personal level, there's you coexist between the fast-paced technology world and the, as James alluded to, the slower, dare I say it, paced government world, and that requires a sort of a level of dynamism that that's quite different in your ability to think in sort of long and the short term. How do you go about that? And do you sort of put on a different hat, or is it just something that comes really natural to you?
I guess 80% of my work is in the private sector, and then I do a small amount of work in the public sector. I think what I would say is that I always want to work in coalitions of the willing. So, you work with the CEs of government agencies that want to make a real difference, and then work with teams that want to make a real difference. And I think that's the thing, is that it's no fun working with people who either don't want to work together or really don't want to change the dial. And every now and then I fall into one of those projects and I slap myself upside the head and go, oh, you did it again. But generally what I find is that, most people do want to have some vision of where they're going and a clear strategy about what our theory is of how that's going to win. And so they're the teams that I work with. I mean, obviously, I tend to work more in the greener, either agri or conservation or environment space within government. But, you can always find good people doing good stuff, and they're the people I work with. I don't see any need to try and push into agencies that don't want it.
Many of the people who, I guess, in our audience who listen to this call are business owners. They might be in professional services or in some other area. So they I guess they joined the call in part because they get the opportunity to listen to insights from how they can think about their business. And are there thoughts you have about scaling up and what business in New Zealand should do to embrace taking on the challenges of the world?
Yeah. Look, I haven't done as, well, how do I put that the other way? The last 2 years I've done more international work than I've done for many years. And one of the biggest opportunities, I think, of the pandemic has been the ability to work with clients globally that used to want you to travel and now just want global talent. And so one of the things I would encourage New Zealanders to think about is that the pandemic has opened up, for services in particular, has opened up a global market in a way that is easier than it's probably ever been. The financial transactions are easier, the contracting is easier, the time zones are still a bit of a pain, but you can do it from home in your jammies, so, who cares that sometimes you're going to have to work through the night. The other thing I would really encourage people to think about is, right from the beginning of my career, I tried to get away in services businesses from time and materials. And I think there are way too many New Zealand businesses doing time and materials, and you are extremely limited. So, if you think about it, you get between 1450 and 1750 hours out of an employee in terms of billable hours. When I was counting my hours, I used to bill roughly 2,100 hours a year. That's not really sustainable, but you've only got a very limited kind of packet of hours if you're in consulting or services. And so we've been talking about this move to value-based pricing for a very long time. I really do believe that if you want to scale, you have to do value-based pricing, because it's the only way to get out of only being able to sell the time that you can get, and particularly in a talent-constrained world, which we're currently in, where you cannot get enough people to sell their hours and body shop them. You have to think about a different business model. Related to that, I would say that one of the smartest things I did was when I started this practice, this Futurist practice, my clients were all on subscription. And so I sign people up for long-term, regular retainers, and I think that's an incredibly important thing to do. And not enough. I think people are still trying to do project work if they're in services, and they really should be thinking about, how do I engage people for 5-6 years? How am I going to keep them? What's the cost of acquisition, and therefore the value of retaining them for 5 or 6 years? And if they'll pay you every month for 5 or 6 years, those are really great customers to have. So how do you move your business model? And even in government, I've been on subscription models, and people tell me that's not possible, and I just got over here doing it, So move to subscription models. The other big thing I would say is that the fastest growing new business model is what we call platform models. So if you think about the Spotifys, the earliest platform was the Apple iTunes store, so they've been around a long time. But this idea of, can I build a platform? What would it take for me to connect customers and providers? And I think, again, those are the companies that scale, the Ubers, the Spotifys, we can probably, the Trade Me. Trade Me's totally a platform business. Etsy, Sharesies. There's a lot of these companies that are platform companies, and they've got real traction. And I think we don't often stop and think, well, what would it take for us to turn this company that I'm in into a platform business? I think the core skill in a platform business is collaboration, and is the willingness to collaborate with others. And again, I think that's a skill that we need to hone in New Zealand. But those would be my top 3 tips. So or probably 4 in there. You've never been easier to do international work, and they pay well. The next one is that, you've got to get away from time and materials. If you didn't do that 20 years ago, today's still a good way to start. Subscription models are everywhere, and how could you turn your business into a platform? Because that's where the real growth is in the current climate.
It sounds like you spend a lot of time obviously in the business, but working on the business. And that's something a lot of people struggle with, to create the space to do that. Do you have a particular mindset when do you allocate a portion of your day, or how do you do that?
I guess what I'm always thinking about eating my own dog food, as they say, So how do I bring that back into, if I'm going to advise a client to do something, am I doing it myself? I joke a bit, like one of the nice things about being a futurist is I get paid to read all the time. I had this running joke with Callahan when I wrote them a thing about how to look for signals, and one of the guys wrote back and said, surely you don't read for like 2 hours a day. And it was like, actually I do you know? And so I get that contemplative time, which makes it easier for me to be able to cross-pollinate new stuff to my businesses, to my clients. I think people don't take enough time to stop and read and think. Yeah, they're too busy doing. But if you actually charged a shitload more, you'd have more time. So, you know, don't undercharge. Like, charge twice as much and work half as hard.
Yeah. It's interesting, just circling back to another thing you said earlier about business models. And I guess one of the themes I've taken from this is innovation in the business model rather than in the product.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're obviously applying that to how you think about charging for your services and what you do. When you think about that, how should, say you're an accounting business or a professional services firm, how do you, it takes quite a big shift in thinking. And did you go through a process to realise that that's what you needed to do?
She's going to start charging you soon,
I
Stefan.
know. I'm happy to pay.
I think I just...
6-year client right here.
Like, I think about the first client that I really did that with, it just made a whole lot of sense because what they needed was ongoing advice, and they didn't want to I didn't want to be keeping timesheets, and they didn't want to be worried about what cost centre it was going to get billed to if they phoned me. And it just became really obvious when I sat down with the CE. I was like, why don't we just agree a bucket of money, and then anyone on your team can call me, and I'll keep a kind of a bit of a track, and if it's too much, I'll charge you a bit more. And if no one calls me over the Christmas holidays, I'll give you a couple of extra days in March. And we've done that now since August of 2016 with that client. And they're super happy, and every now and then I charge them for 3 or 4 extra days, and then every now and then I give them a few days, and it's just worked out really well. But the alignment between their need and the right way to bill became really obvious. Do you know? And I think about my own accountant. I get a bit sick of these really lumpy kind of bills, you know. I pay my Xero every month, you know. Perhaps I'd be interested in just smoothing and paying my accountant every month instead of it really lumpy. I've been with that accountant now for about 10 years. I pretty much know what he charges me. If he wanted to charge that to me monthly, you know, I'd be fine with that. But he hasn't really thought about what the value to me is in terms of aligning my needs and the pricing. And I think that's the thing, is that if you think about it that way, like, again, even with the Ministry for the Environment, just people knowing they could get on the phone and call me, that it wasn't going to affect their budget line. They could say, hey, I'm running a futures process. Can you just run me through how scenarios works? Or I'm thinking about doing something like this with young people. You know, would you be interested in hosting it? And I'll go, great, let's do it on Mural. And they go, fine. And, you know, we end up with a Zoom and a Mural with a bunch of kids who would never be able to come into the office. But it's an alignment of the value and the pricing. And I think that's the way to change it, is if this is just a one-off project, charge it that way. If this is something where it's really long-term and the value to the client is being able to access you long-term, make it a long-term contract. Change the game.
Awesome. Last question for me. I'm conscious of...
I got to go soon.
You've got a meeting in time. And when you think about the developments in technology that are happening right now, and obviously you've got to focus on agri-tech, what are the top couple of things that really stand out for you that aren't commonly known? Are there any kind of movements underway that you feel are bubbling there but haven't hit the headlines yet?
Yeah, I've got a couple of big ones. So one is urban agriculture. So the real growth in vertical farming and the ability to farm on roofs, in basements, in unused commercial space, and to create organic, fresh vegetables and fruit increasingly at source, so you can pretty much cut it and walk it to the restaurant or cut it and walk it to your customers. Where that has got really smart was the first sort of 5 years of those companies all went broke. This company called Plenty that I watch closely, that's Arama Kukatai, who's a New Zealander, is CEO of in San Francisco. And they've got a subscription model, so they're doing subscription model with restaurants at the same time as vertical farming, and they've got solar on the roof. So, solar is absolutely smashing it worldwide. It's cheaper now to install and run solar than it is just to run nuclear. So the economics where you bring together that urban agriculture, organic hydroponics, and a subscription business model, smart. Right. Second one is precision fermentation. So I speak at a lot of dairy conferences globally. There are two big changes coming to dairy that I believe. So one of them is there's some companies, Helena, Turtle Tree Labs and BioMilk, all of whom have products in the market, all of whom are making bioidentical human breast milk in the lab. And I can't see in the future why someone is going to buy infant formula made by a cow with sort of 39 additives, including palm oil, versus bioidentical human milk. And so I think they're the really big ones that I'm watching. And we also can see that biofermentation of whey and other products that are made in a cow at the moment, I believe they're going to be made in vats, fairly soon. And it's one of those ones that's going to be gradual and then sudden. So I'm not saying that there's no future for New Zealand's dairy industry. I think there is a future for cheese and other products, but I'm very, very wary of the future for infant formula.
This has been the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds KiwiSaver scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, the NZ Funds Advised Portfolio Service, the NZ Funds Wealth Builder, and NZ Funds Income Generator. A product disclosure statement for each is available at nzfunds.co.nz. Past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future returns.